AITA for kicking out my dad's new wife after learning he never owned our house. My dad was always the kind of man who thought he was the center of everything. For as long as I can remember, he was one of those people who spoke more than they listened, who demanded respect but gave it out in small amounts, and who never seemed satisfied with anything my sister and I did, no matter how hard we tried. My mom, on the other hand, I saw as a quiet force that kept everything running, from the house to the emotions of everyone around her. She did not need to raise her voice or impose anything. She simply made things hold together with her presence. My childhood was spent in one of those classic white clapboard houses with a wide front porch and flower boxes in the windowsills, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. It was a house inherited by my mom from my maternal grandparents, and every corner held a piece of family history. The kitchen walls still carried the same soft pastel color my grandmother had chosen before she passed. The rocking chair in the living room still creaked with that familiar sound that made the house feel alive even on the quietest days. But over the years, that home ended up becoming a stage for betrayals, secrets, and a stand I never planned, but which became necessary. Mom passed when I was 24 years old, and although the illness had been long, nothing prepares you for the exact moment when she is no longer there. I remember that my dad did not cry that day. In fact, he did not even stay long at the service. He said he could not bear to see Mom like that he preferred to remember her the way she was before, full of life. But the truth is that for a long time, it was noticeable that he was in another distant world, as if he had already started saying goodbye to her long before he actually lost her. Instead, I stayed for hours next to the casket, mentally going over every conversation I did not have, every hug I did not give, every time I told her I would call her later when she asked me to talk for a while. It was the first time I felt that time was a cruel trap. Barely had the first anniversary of her passing gone by when my dad showed up with a new woman. He said he had met her on a Caribbean cruise, that she helped him laugh again and feel alive again. According to him, she was a blessing. Her name was Nicole, and the first thing I thought when I saw her was that you could tell she had experience getting what she wanted. Not because she was rude or did anything improper, but because she spoke with such careful sweetness that it did not seem natural. Besides, she was barely a few years older than me, which in itself made me uncomfortable. But what hurt me the most was that my dad did not give us any warning. One day, he simply told me he was going to introduce me to someone, and the next he was already saying they were getting married. There was no family dinner, no serious conversation, nothing, just a statement thrown into the air, as if the fact that he was happy was enough for everyone else to have to smile. When I found out they had gotten married, I did not even bother to fake happiness. My sister, who was always more diplomatic, tried to get a little closer to Nicole, but it did not last long. She is not a bad person, but she has this way of talking to you as if you should be thanking her for something, she told me one day. I had noticed it too. Nicole walked around the house as if it already belonged to her, moving things, giving opinions on what needed to be changed, criticizing details that were part of our history. One day she even said, while we were in the family dining room, that the kitchen needed an urgent remodel because it looked like it came straight out of an 80s catalog. She said it without knowing that that place had been redesigned by Mom when I was a kid, that every tile and every cabinet had been chosen with love by her. I held back. I said nothing, but that was the first crack I felt opening inside me. A couple of months later, my dad called us for a family meeting, something he never did. I thought maybe he wanted to apologize for having done everything so fast, or maybe he would announce something important like selling the house and moving to a smaller place. But what he said was worse. In front of my sister, Nicole, and me, he read a new will, one he had drafted just a few weeks ago, leaving absolutely everything to his new wife. Bank accounts, his pickup truck, the stocks he had, and the most painful thing of all, the house. Nicole is my partner, and I want her to be protected if I am gone someday, he said, as if we did not exist, as if we had not been there for him during the worst years of Mom's illness. As if it did not matter that that house was not his, but part of my mother's family legacy. He said it with a coldness that left me speechless. My sister cried in silence. I simply looked at him, feeling that something inside me was breaking permanently. That night I stayed at the house. I locked myself in my old room, which still held parts of my adolescence trapped between posters and old books, and I did not sleep for a single minute. I kept thinking about Mom, thinking about everything she had built, about everything she had protected. And then I remembered something she always mentioned, a safe behind the old oak dresser. When I got up, I moved the piece of furniture, and there it was. It was nothing very modern, but it still had the same combination she had told me once when we were talking about important documents. Inside there were papers, many property titles, old bank statements, handwritten letters, and something that left me breathless, a folder from Mom's trusted lawyer. Inside was a copy of the house title completely in her name, excluding my father, with a sign clause indicating that the property had been a direct inheritance from my grandparents and that it was protected by a revocable trust. One that legally activated at the time of her passing and left the property exclusively to her children, meaning my sister and me. I sat there reading that document with my eyes wide open, my heart racing, and holding my breath. Mom had foreseen everything. Mom had thought of us, and Dad either did not know or had intentionally ignored it. At that moment, I no longer felt anger. I felt clarity. The clarity that this was not just about a will, or a whim, or an emotional reaction. It was something bigger. It was justice. It was time to defend what was ours. It was time to make sure Mom, even from wherever she was, knew her voice still counted, that her decisions would not be erased by the arrogance of a man who thought his new love could cancel out decades of family history. And so, with the documents in hand and my determination ignited, I began the path that would lead me, without yet knowing it, to take a stand that would completely change our family dynamic. Because if that night taught me anything, it was that sometimes the silence of the departed echoes louder than any shout from the living. Update 1. Barely 2 days passed since I found Mom's folder before I gathered the courage to look for the lawyer whose name appeared on all the documents. His name was Michael Harrington, and to my surprise, he was still active, although no longer at the firm from when Mom hired him. He had opened his own office downtown, one of those unassuming places that do not draw attention from the outside, but inside everything smelled like old wood, heavy files, and decades of experience. I made an appointment with his assistant without mentioning many details, and when I finally sat across from him, it did not take more than 5 seconds for him to recognize my mother's name. He said it with a sad smile and an almost involuntary nod, like someone remembering a person who left a genuine mark on them. He asked me if everything was all right, and although I tried to sound calm, I ended up telling him almost everything, that my father had remarried a woman who seemed more interested in material things than anything else, that he had drafted a new will leaving the house in her name, and that this very same house, according to Mom's papers, never belonged to him. As I spoke, Michael Harrington frowned, reviewed the documents I had brought, and made small notes in his notebook with that fast, precise handwriting of those who have spent decades dealing with legal matters. He told me something I had not considered, that the house was protected by the revocable trust my mother had left signed shortly before she passed, and since that trust went into effect upon her passing, neither my father nor his wife could dispose of the property, much less mortgage it, sell it, or transfer it to a third party. He explained that technically the house was not part of the marital estate nor any inventory that could be claimed via a will, and furthermore, the existence of that trust was completely independent of my father's new marriage. Legally, it was as if the house had never been available to him. Not only that, according to the trust, the property was to be divided equally between my sister and me. And the only reason it had not happened yet was because the formal process to execute that document was never activated. The problem, of course, was that during all that time my father had acted as if he were the sole owner. He had remodeled several areas, taken out a home equity line of credit against the property, and even registered some renovations with his signature as the legitimate owner. Michael Harrington was very clear in telling me that this was not simply a mistake, but a misappropriation of assets. He told me about something called a quiet title action, a legal process that allows asking a judge to review the validity of a property title when there are disputes or ambiguities. In this case, he said, the dispute was clear. There was a person acting as the owner of an asset that legally belonged to other people, and with the documents I had in hand, the case looked quite solid. He asked if I wanted to proceed, and I did not hesitate for a second. I signed all the necessary powers of attorney, authorized his office to retrieve any supplementary county records, and walked out of there with a strange mix of adrenaline and vertigo. I knew that while I had the law on my side, I was also opening a door that would not close easily. My dad was not one to accept defeat without a fight. Over the following days, the lawsuit was drafted with all the details, from the existence of the trust to the exact dates of every relevant document, including the recent one my father had presented. Michael Harrington also included a request for a temporary injunction that would prevent any movement or transaction regarding the property while the case was under review. That meant if the judge approved it, neither my father nor his wife could sell, rent, mortgage, or legally alter the house during that time. It was a way to shield the process from any desperate move. When the lawsuit was finally filed in county court, I knew there was no turning back. The notice was served on a date that ended up being, unintentionally, a sort of poetic justice. It was the same day my father and Nicole were hosting a sort of informal get-together to show off the new kitchen they had remodeled a few months prior. They had installed marble countertops, new appliances, and even sleek pendant lights that completely clashed with the classic style of the house. I was not invited, of course, but I found out from a cousin who attended that the gathering ended abruptly when the process server knocked on the door, handed over the papers, and read out loud that it was a lawsuit disputing the legal ownership of the property. Nicole became visibly upset and caused a scene, insisting that this was unfair and that she was not going to let us take away what she believed rightfully belonged to her as a wife. My father, on his end, went into a state of denial. He said I was being manipulated, that it was all a misunderstanding, that surely there was some misunderstood clause. But the truth is that even though he tried to look calm, it was obvious he had no idea those documents existed, or at least he had decided to ignore them hoping nothing would come to light. That same night he called me, not to apologize or clarify anything, but to raise his voice and say that I was tearing the family apart, that Mom would surely be disappointed in me if she saw what I was doing, and that I was doing all this to get back at him for not feeling important enough after his new marriage. He accused me of using my mother's name to cover up my resentment. I stayed quiet, not because I lacked answers, but because for the first time in my life I understood that sometimes silence is stronger than any argument. I let him talk. I let him say harsh things. I let him hang up. Then I sat in the living room, looked at the walls where some old photos still hung, and understood that the fight was just beginning, but I was no longer afraid. Now I had a purpose, a document signed by my mother, and the certainty that I was doing the right thing. The rest would follow. Update 2. A little over 3 months had already passed since everything came to light, and the lawsuit was officially registered in the county system. What started as a quiet procedure inside a carpeted office smelling of stale coffee soon turned into a family earthquake that dragged away all attempts to fake normalcy. My father and Nicole continued living in the house while the process moved forward, although no longer with the same confident attitude as before. You could tell the uncertainty was eating them alive, and although in public they tried to maintain the image of a solid couple being persecuted by ungrateful children, the truth is the tension inside those walls must have been suffocating. As for me, I never set foot in the house again, not out of fear, but because I needed to keep an emotional distance so as not to get carried away by anger. I had to focus on the facts, on what was on paper, not on the provocations of two people who were used to stepping on things without looking at who they were affecting. My sister, however, had a much harder time. This whole situation overwhelmed her emotionally. For years, she had tried to maintain a somewhat functional relationship with my father, more out of necessity than affection. And when Nicole showed up, she tried to do the right thing, to be cordial, not to cause problems. But when she found out he had also tried to include in the new will some savings accounts that were originally opened by my mom for the college fund of her grandchildren, who were not even born yet, she broke down. She called me one night crying like when we were teenagers, and all we could do was hold each other in silence until the storm passed. She told me it no longer hurt just because of Mom, but because of what that man had allowed, because of how his silence had been just as damaging as any open betrayal. I assured her it was no longer about fighting for a piece of property, but about putting a name to a truth that for years had masqueraded as normalcy, that he always put his own desires above his family. Legally, things were starting to move. Michael Harrington informed me that the judge assigned to the case had accepted the request for a temporary injunction freezing any transaction related to the house. That meant any attempt to sell it, remortgage it, refinance it, or even make substantial renovations had to be authorized by the court. It was a direct hit, especially because Nicole was already in negotiations to install a solar system on the roof and had signed with a company that made loans backed by home equity. The company was notified and backed out of the deal immediately, which sparked a new wave of frustration, raised voices, and barely disguised threats that reached us in the form of passive-aggressive messages, public comments, and even veiled social media posts where Nicole talked about being stripped by people who never valued other people's hard work. What surprised me the most in those days was discovering the extent to which my dad had let himself be absorbed by that narrative. He started visiting distant relatives and friends telling distorted versions of the story. He said Mom had signed that trust without telling him anything, that she surely did it under the influence of her siblings, that she never meant to leave him out of anything, and that we had manipulated everything to take it all away from him. Instead of accepting the truth, he covered it with layers and layers of half-truths until he convinced himself he was the victim. He even tried showing up at Michael Harrington's office without an appointment, demanding a copy of the entire file because he had the right as a husband. To which the paralegal replied as professionally as possible that he no longer had any legal power over that property and that any communication had to go through his own lawyer. By the following week, he already had won, a guy with a high-pitched voice, a crooked tie, and a gaze that seemed more focused on impressing than reading. I was not worried. However, the most interesting thing happened when the bank that had approved their home equity line of credit for the renovations discovered that the mortgaged asset did not legally belong to them. Up to that point, they had assumed the title was clean because my father signed as the sole owner, but they never checked the trust records. As soon as the lawsuit appeared in the system, the bank's legal department reacted strongly. They sent a formal letter demanding explanations, warning that if they lost the collateral, they would be forced to demand immediate full payment of the loan. Nicole, who had already started bragging about having a finer kitchen than any design magazine, suddenly found herself facing a considerable unsecured debt. I did not know whether to laugh or worry, because while I hated what they had done, I also understood that the consequences were just beginning. Around that same time, I received a handwritten letter from my father. I did not read it right away. It took me 2 days to find the mood to open it. When I did, I found 3 full pages where he tried to justify himself, talking about how lonely he felt after Mom passed, how he needed to start over, how Nicole had arrived at a time when he felt aimless. He said he had no intention of leaving us out of anything, that he simply wanted to rebuild his life without feeling tied to past decisions. He talked about love, freedom, new opportunities. But at no point did he mention Mom with respect. In no paragraph did he acknowledge that the house was never his. Everything revolved around him, what he felt, what he thought he deserved. And that was when I understood there was no mistake to correct or misunderstanding to clear up. There was a much simpler truth. He never believed that what my mother built was something he needed to respect. He thought he could ignore it, erase it, rewrite it. Update 3. Almost 1 year had passed since we started the whole legal process, and although time dragged on with maddening slowness, every step forward in court was like peeling an old layer of paint off a wall that could no longer hide its cracks. The case had gone through several stages: document review, written testimonies, a notary review of county records, and finally, a formal hearing where both sides would present our arguments. Michael Harrington took care of preparing all the evidence, from the trust deeds to the bank statements and the previous legal communications Mom had registered. Nothing was improvised. Every document backed up the same thing, that the house never belonged to my father from day one, and that the attempt to take it over through a subsequently drafted will was not only invalid, but completely irrelevant from a legal standpoint. The day of the main hearing, my sister and I arrived at the courthouse early. It was a sober courtroom, without luxury, with the typical uncomfortable wooden benches and the state flag in a corner. The assigned judge was an older man with a serious face, who did not seem to have much patience for emotional arguments or unnecessary delays. He listened in complete silence while Michael Harrington laid everything out clearly, showing the trust, explaining the nature of the document, and highlighting the fact that my father was never included as a joint owner, not even on the original deed. He also mentioned that in recent months, my father had signed contracts, executed remodels, and opened lines of credit using a property that never belonged to him, and that this could constitute an act of bad faith. When it was my dad's lawyer's turn to speak, the contrast was glaring. You could tell he had tried to build a case based on sympathy, talking about the time my father lived in the house, his marriage to my mother, the supposed implicit agreement between them. He mentioned that my dad had contributed financially to the home's upkeep, paid utilities, repairs, taxes, and that this should carry some weight when making a decision. But the judge stopped him. He asked if he had any document proving my father's legal inclusion as a joint owner. The lawyer hesitated, tried to talk his way around the answer, and eventually had to admit he did not. The judge paused briefly, reviewed some papers, and said something that is still burned into my memory word for word. Custom is not ownership, presence is not a right, and wishes, however legitimate they may seem, do not replace what was established by law. It was the first time in that whole year I felt someone outside of us understood the core of the matter. It was not just a dispute over bricks. It was a defense of the respect my mother deserved. The ruling was handed down that same day. In a clear and direct verdict, the judge determined that the property belonged entirely to the beneficiaries of the original trust, meaning my sister and me. He ordered that any subsequent lien affecting the property be considered invalid and that the title be officially corrected in the county records. Furthermore, he issued an eviction order with a 60-day deadline for my father and Nicole to vacate the property. Michael Harrington tried to extend the deadline to 90 days as a gesture of consideration, but I refused. There were limits even to empathy, and after everything they had put us through, 60 days already seemed too generous to me. That afternoon my dad called me, not to raise his voice this time, but with a dull tone, as if he no longer had the energy to pretend he was in control. He told me he did not understand how it had come to this, that everything had gotten out of hand, that Nicole had convinced him it was the fair thing to do, and that he had wanted to believe her because he needed to feel he could start over without carrying the past. He asked me for time. He asked for calm. He asked for compassion. But I was no longer in that headspace. I told him, with all the firmness I could muster, that Mom had not built that home for him to gamble away on a whim, that if he truly ever believed he loved us, the least he could have done was respect her wishes. He stayed quiet, then said, "Maybe I made a mistake," and hung up. Over the following weeks, my sister and I began preparing the legal transition of the title. We had to deal with the banks, with the utility companies, with the accumulated taxes that had not been paid since Nicole and my father settled in there. It was a tedious process, loaded with technical details, but every signature we gave felt like closing a long, uncomfortable, yet necessary chapter. One afternoon, while reviewing the house inventory with Michael Harrington to certify that everything was properly recorded, we found a blue folder tucked into the back of a filing cabinet in the office my father used. Inside were notes written by him, drafts of a will he never got around to signing, one where he tried to leave the house to Nicole using arguments we now knew were invalid. It surprised me to see how seriously he had tried to justify what he did. It was not just impulsivity. He had planned every step, and yet he failed because he never counted on Mom having left everything so clear. The day the deadline arrived, Nicole packed in silence. A moving truck came in the morning and took away her modern furniture, her abstract paintings, her expensive dishware. She did not speak a word to me. She did not even look at me. My father was the last to leave. He carried an old leather suitcase and had the weary face of someone who no longer had anywhere to go. He did not say goodbye. He simply closed the door behind him and left. I walked in, calmly went through every room, took a deep breath in the kitchen where Mom used to bake bread on Sundays, and for the first time in years, I felt the house breathing in peace again. Not because we had won, but because the chaos they tried to impose no longer had any power, because Mom, even after death, was still looking after what was hers. And because sometimes doing the right thing is not about immediate payback, but about restoring what never should have been altered. Update 4. A little over 1 year passed since the house was officially put under our name and my father was required to leave it. And although many people thought the story had reached its end there, The truth is that court ruling was merely the first layer of something much deeper that was still falling apart. I thought that after the eviction, my father was going to try to rebuild his life quietly. Maybe remorseful, maybe just resigned, but the opposite happened. His financial situation began to crumble at a speed not even he could anticipate, and with it began the collapse of the entire facade he had built with Nicole, a facade that was apparently held up more by appearances than real stability. A few months after the trial, we received a notice from the same bank that had granted the loan for the kitchen remodel. It explained that since the mortgage collateral had been invalidated, the credit automatically became the personal debt of the applicants, meaning my dad and Nicole, who now had to take on the full amount owed without any asset backing. The tone of the document was cold, almost clinical, but the message was clear. They had to pay everything, and they had to do it soon. My father, who had already sold his pickup truck to try to cover part of the legal expenses from the trial, suddenly found himself with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, no assets to his name, and a partner who was starting to show very obvious cracks. It did not take long before Nicole, who until then had stayed in the shadows, decided to make her move. She started making arrangements on her own, first trying to negotiate with the bank, then consulting a financial lawyer to evaluate the possibility of filing for individual bankruptcy. My father, as I learned from a distant relative with whom I still kept in sporadic contact, begged her not to do it. Comment: This story really stayed with me, and I hope it did for you too. I believe protecting our self-respect is something we should never compromise on. Setting healthy boundaries shows strength, not selfishness. Taking responsibility for our own healing is one of the most powerful choices we can make. Sometimes, walking away or standing firm is the kindest thing we can do for ourselves. Choosing peace after difficult times allows us to truly move forward. I hope this reminds you to honor what matters most in your life. Being kind to yourself is just as important as being kind to others. Real growth often begins when we decide to value our own worth. Thank you for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.